the glamorous daughter in Texas. My name is Madison Carter, and as I sit here in the quiet, sunlit foyer of my family's vast estate in Houston, I can't help but reflect on how everyone, from school friends to distant family, has always seen me. To the outside world, I was the quintessential rich girl. Designer clothes straight from Fifth Avenue, luxury SUVs with my initials embroidered on the seatbacks, art lessons, and summers in Europe. The Carters are old money in Texas, known for oil, real estate, and what my grandmother would call a certain Texan pizzazz. But when you peel away the monogrammed towels and garden parties, the truth was never quite so golden. My father, Henry Carter, was the invincible patriarch, publicly charismatic and loving, but behind closed doors, colder than a marble statue. Maybe it was because my mother passed away when I was only 7. Or perhaps he'd built so many walls around his heart. There wasn't room for anyone else. Of course, it didn't help when he remarried a year later. Ellen, glamorous and shrewd, moved into our lives with her daughter, my stepsister, Lauren, who was 2 years younger, but acted like she owned the place the moment she put her bags down. I remember sitting at our oversized dining table, with Dad at the head, Ellen to his right, and Lauren smiling too brightly across from me. The room felt big enough to swallow me whole. Since Mom's death, Dad had turned his attention to business and let the staff raise me. Ellen never pretended to be my mother. She was always polite, but distant. Lauren, on the other hand, immediately started calling my father Dad, with an ease that stung. Overnight, I went from being an only child to the invisible one. I was the girl with everything, but I would have traded every diamond bracelet for one real conversation with my father. I coped by focusing on my studies and extracurriculars, varsity tennis, debate club, charity events, any way to keep myself busy and out of the house. At parties, I wore my best smile, but I always felt like a guest at my own life. People envied the Carter name, but inside those high brick walls, it was a castle made of glass, ready to shatter with the smallest sound. Power, handed to an outsider. I'll never forget the day I learned that most of my father's estate, including the grand house, the land, and the controlling shares in our family business, was being handed over not to his own daughter, but to Clara, Miranda's daughter. I was 24, finally finding my footing in the world, when my life was upended with a single legal document. My father called us into his study, leather-bound books, heavy drapes, that smell of aged cigar and cologne, and explained with infuriating calm that for the sake of modernizing the legacy, he had decided assets would go to whomever showed the sharpest potential as a leader. His eyes landed on Clara. My heart dropped. Modernizing? I had interned in every department of our company for the last 5 years, did charity work every weekend, managed parts of the ranch by myself. Clara had hosted exactly 3 fundraisers, all photo ops, and spent more time in Aspen than Houston. But Dad seemed absolutely convinced. Miranda placed a gentle hand on his arm, offering reassurance. Clara looked down at the floor and mustered a modest, almost embarrassed smile. But I could see the triumph flicker in her eyes. Suddenly, Clara was everywhere, issuing directives to staff, renovating rooms, even replacing art on the walls like she owned the place. I was left answering curious whispers from family friends, dodging speculation at every social function. It would have been humiliating enough if Dad were acting out of principle, but I couldn't escape the suspicion that there was another force at work. Clara's sudden closeness with Dad, Miranda's secret meetings with the family lawyer, and the subtle locking away of certain files. It all felt orchestrated. I'd always believed the bonds of blood and shared memories were unbreakable. But in a matter of weeks, I was an outsider in my father's house, watching my family's fortune and future being signed away without a fight. At night, lying awake in a room that had always been mine, I resolved to find out just what was going on beneath that polished surface. If Clara and Miranda expected me to vanish quietly, they'd underestimated the Blakes. And me, most of all. Cracks in the family and sleepless nights, lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. But after the will announcement, sleep became a stranger to me. Furtive, fleeting, slipping out the window the second I closed my eyes. There's something about the vast emptiness of a mansion at night that makes every shadow seem sinister, and every distant noise sound like a threat. If you've ever felt alone in your own home, you know what I mean. I started noticing the little things first. Lorraine and Olivia would have these hushed conversations that always stopped when I entered a room. Doors would be locked, Dad's office, Lorraine's study, when they never had been before. The housekeeper, Maria, looked at me with nervous pity one morning, then shook her head as if she'd said too much. Even the staff who dusted family photos for decades began whispering their goodbyes. Fear can be sneaky, masquerading as anger or even motivation. I found myself growing sharp, suspicious. I took walks late into the night, down those marble halls, my bare feet aching on cool stone, just to clear my head and chase down the faint whiff of cologne that still lingered from my dad. I noticed Olivia carrying files marked confidential into her room. Lorraine was obsessed with locking away documents and making late-night calls from the veranda. Those nights stretched on endlessly. I'd lie in bed and listen. Rain against the windows, 2 stories below. The shudder of shutters in the wind. Every so often, I'd hear voices, urgent, tense, stifled as if someone was pressing a hand over a mouthpiece. More than once, I found myself pressed up against a closed office door, holding my breath, catching fragments of conversation. Transfer, beneficiary, leverage. My gut told me trouble was brewing. Each day, I tried to keep a routine. Ride my horse out by the southern pasture before breakfast. Answer the emails Olivia forwarded with saccharine little notes. Just a gentle reminder. And make polite conversation at dinner. All the while, mapping escape routes in my head. My body was running on fumes and coffee, and still nobody in that echoing house seemed to notice. One evening, while returning from a restless walk, I overheard Lorraine and Olivia talking in the conservatory, their silhouettes blurred by the moonlight. Are you sure Richard won't change his mind? Olivia's voice quivered, not with fear, but anticipation. Lorraine's answer was low and vicious. Not after this week. Everything's almost in place. Later, I tried confiding in my oldest friend, Jackson, a lawyer who'd known my family since grade school. He told me to be careful, to keep records, and most importantly, to trust my instincts. You know your own story better than anyone, he said. After that, I began keeping a notebook, logging every odd conversation, every document that went missing, every closed-door meeting. I snapped photos of ledgers and texts left on kitchen counters. At first, it felt foolish, paranoid, like playing detective in my own tragedy. But under every layer of doubt was the raw certainty that, for once, I had to act. Of all the things I thought I'd have to fight for in life, my place in the family, my voice, my truth, turned out to be the most fragile. It was almost a relief to have something real to lose. With every sleepless night, I found resolve hardening where heartbreak used to be. In between the fear, in the hours just before dawn, I remembered my mother's advice. Never trust a silence when people stand to gain from it. Sitting at that moon-soaked window, watching the first pale streaks of sun slice through the oak trees, I made another promise. I'd get to the bottom of this, whatever it took. Because home isn't where you sleep. It's what you protect when no one else will. Unveiling the dark conspiracy. I've always believed the quietest moments are when the truth creeps in. No matter how much marble and crystal you surround yourself with, secrets never sleep. They move underfoot, like the roots of the oldest live oak in our front pasture. Twisting, deepening, waiting for the rain to expose them. I decided to stop waiting and started acting. My first step was following the shadows. Not just the literal shadows in the house at night, but the patterns in behavior, the slip-ups in conversation, the inconsistencies in the estate paperwork. Lila, for all her poise, had a tell. She chewed her lower lip when lying. I watched it one evening in the library as she assured my father she wasn't involved in anything irregular. But I'd seen her with our attorney, working much later than any legitimate business justified. There's a unique loneliness in suspecting your family of betrayal, a kind of ache that makes you question even your own memories. Wasn't I being paranoid? Maybe grief over my mother or the sting of Dad's rejection warped my judgment, but the evidence kept mounting. A bank statement slipped under my door by a loyal staff member showed large withdrawals traced to offshore accounts in Lila's name. Contract drafts slipped out of legalese and into outright theft. Even the trusted house manager, Mr. Camden, confessed quietly, "Miss Scarlett, you need to be careful." After weeks of careful vigilance, I orchestrated a plan to catch them in the act. The annual Harper Foundation Gala provided the perfect backdrop, half the city's eyes on our family. Security at every door, everyone dressed in their glittering best. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. The night before the gala, I set tiny digital recorders in my father's private office in the anteroom where Lila and Grace often held hushed meetings. I spent hours reviewing access logs and schedules, cross-referencing them with altered bank records I'd managed to copy from our accountant's office. My hands shook as I pieced together the timeline. Meetings with shell corporations, falsified signatures, a stream of money flowing steadily out of the family's accounts under Dad's nose. I'll never forget the sight. Lila and Grace together, believing they were alone, reviewing a final document designed to transfer the controlling shares of Harper Holdings. Grace's cool tone, "Tomorrow, after the announcement, it all becomes official. Charles won't question it. Scarlett is out of the picture." That was my breaking point. Not with anger, not with childlike desperation, but with a cold, focused resolve I didn't know I had. I captured their conversation, photographed the damning paperwork, and copied emails left open too long on the laptop. The moments ticked by in sharp, urgent clarity. My hands steady, my breath measured, my mind laser-focused. The other thing about secrets is how quickly they unravel once exposed. That night, before dawn, I compiled every shred of evidence and organized it into a file. A call to our family lawyer, one of my mother's oldest friends, set the wheels of justice in motion. As the sun rose over our estate, I stood by the window, files in hand, no longer haunted by sleeplessness. I finally understood what my mother meant by home means fighting for the truth when no one else will. And I was ready, for the first time, to fight for it openly. Courage and decisiveness. Standing at the crossroads between despair and action, I realized that courage isn't something you inherit, like a diamond necklace or a plot of land. You carve it, one trembling decision at a time. From all the pain and confusion that's poured into your bones. These were the days that demanded every drop of resolve I'd ever hoped to muster. The days inched toward the gala, and every second was a razor's edge. I woke at dawn, my heart in my throat, and my senses tuned to the hush that came before the household stirred. I found myself in front of the bathroom mirror, tracing the hard line of my jaw, searching for traces of the little girl who once dreamed of her father's approval. She was gone, replaced by someone who understood that family loyalty could become a double-edged sword. Every move had to be strategic. My first priority was to make sure my father, who seemed sheltered in his own way, wasn't blindsided by Miranda and Alyssa's theater. But I couldn't simply show my hand. Any hint of confrontation, and the schemers would cover their tracks. I started leaving small, anonymous notes, printouts of forensic bank transfers, excerpts of legal emails, on Dad's desk without any trace of origin. It gave him pause, made him ask vague questions at breakfast, and I could see seeds of doubt growing in his eyes. Still, he said nothing, as if unsure which daughter to trust, or unwilling to believe evil could come from within our walls. As pressure mounted, so did the risk of exposure. One evening, Miranda caught me glancing into her open laptop. She closed the lid with a snap, her eyes narrowing. "Is there something you need, Charlotte?" Her voice was ice, but I let out my best Southern lady laugh and replied, "Just checking when the new dinner reservations are for the gala. You know how Dad fusses if he ends up eating after 8. The tension sizzled. I excused myself, heart pounding so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. I found unlikely allies among the staff. Rosa, ever loyal, slipped me a thumb drive she'd found in Miranda's trash. It contained scanned copies of rewritten documents, their metadata pointing to late-night edits the evening after the gala's guest list was finalized. I shared everything quietly with Max, the lawyer, his voice calm and reassuring as he promised to keep things strictly confidential. "You're playing chess, not checkers," he told me. "Only move if you're certain. Let them think they're winning." As days blurred into sleepless nights, I felt fear gripping me, but it was soon replaced by a furious clarity. Watching Dad drift between work and the new family routine, noticing the way Alyssa's smile slipped whenever I entered the room, I started to feel less like a frightened girl and more like the rightful heir to our legacy. I began practicing my statements in the shower. What would I say to a boardroom of elders? How could I prove my case without looking unhinged or vengeful? The weekend of the gala arrived. For the first time in months, Dad actually asked to have breakfast with me alone. Over black coffee and eggs, he studied me. "You seem different, Charlotte. Is everything all right?" My throat tightened, but I remembered Max's words. "Be calm. Be factual. I think you should look into some of the company's transactions, Dad. Some of the trust assets are at risk." He searched my face for a sign of accusation. Not finding any, I spent that day gathering my case, meticulously labeling each bank wire, labeling the email trail, noting the timestamps, and printing out surveillance stills from the nanny cam. By nightfall, I had a binder 3 inches thick, everything organized chronologically, the storyline as clear as a thriller novel. No detail was too small. Dates, amounts, names, signatures all lined up, impossible to ignore. Backstage at the gala, I steadied my nerves behind a curtain as the ballroom filled with Dallas's elite. Politicians, CEOs, society columnists. Alyssa was glowing in a gold gown, barking orders to caterers as though she were the hostess, not the usurper. Miranda fluttered anxiously, rehearsing her speech to donors. I moved quietly, greeting old friends and board members, radiating an easy confidence that belied my anxiety. As Dad took the stage to announce what was meant to be Alyssa's ascension, I made my move. Stepping forward, I requested to say a few words on behalf of the family. All eyes turned. With my heart beating in my temples, I laid out the truth, point by point, fact by fact, showcasing not just a betrayal of trust, but a premeditated scheme against the Whitman legacy. No name-calling, no tears, just cold, hard facts. When I was done, the silence in the ballroom was electric. The fallout was swift, but strangely anticlimactic. Dad demanded an audit, the board froze all asset transfers, and Miranda and Alyssa stammered denials that grew thinner with each wave of evidence. I expected public scenes, screaming, sobbing, maybe even some kind of physical removal. But in the end, it was the quiet that lingered. The guests filed out, murmuring disbelief and sympathy. And suddenly, I was left alone with my father. Dad's hands trembled as he reviewed the binders. "I'm sorry," he managed. The first time I'd heard those words in my adult life. "I didn't want to believe." I shook my head. "You don't owe me understanding. You owe this family the truth." I meant every word. The real victory wasn't the redistribution of power or the return of what was rightfully mine. It was finding that, after all the loneliness, the doubts, the nights I wanted to disappear, I had become someone who could stand in the light, unwavering. I was done waiting to be invited into my own life. If courage is a choice, then every step I took, every risk, every whisper in the dark had led here. There would be more storms. I could sense them brewing. But for the first time, I felt ready to face them. Not as the fragile daughter in someone else's home, but as the true steward of my family's name. Turning the tables with resolve. The judgment day finally arrived, looming over my head like a summer storm waiting to break. All the preparation, all the silent suffering, and the months of feeling invisible sharpened into a kind of electric focus. That morning, I woke up before dawn, my heart pounding, mind racing. I dressed carefully, not for the elegance the Carters were known for, but with the determination of someone ready for battle. As I fastened the silver locket my mother once gave me, I whispered a silent promise. I wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. My first step was to gather my evidence. A battered leather folder carefully labeled and chronologically arranged. Inside were digital printouts, bank records, anonymous tips, time-stamped emails, and the audio recording that, up until this point, had felt more like a burden than a weapon. I tucked it under my arm and headed to the office, the sun a faint promise on the horizon. Walking through the house, I could feel the tension humming in the walls. The staff avoided my eyes. Olivia, forever poised, watched me pass with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. I caught Lorraine in the den, whispering into her phone with her back to the window. It didn't matter anymore. Today, the truth was going to eclipse every shadow in this house. I owed it to my mother, my younger self, and to every silent ally who had quietly placed their trust in me. As the clock struck 9, my father, accustomed to making others wait for him, was already seated at the head of the long, polished table in his office. Lorraine and Olivia to his right, faces stiff, eyes darting like cornered animals. The board of directors filtered in, grave and murmuring, clutching binders and notepads. To them, this was just another meeting. To me, it was the reckoning. I began by distributing copies of the documents, my hands steady in a way that surprised even me. I spoke slowly, outlining the timeline, the first suspicious transfer, the mysterious phone calls, the legal maneuvering cloaked as modernization of the estate. I played the recordings, Lorraine's voice unmistakable, plotting, and Olivia's complicit assurance that everything would go according to plan. Faces fell. There was no longer any room for denial. "Would you care to explain this?" I asked, looking directly at Lorraine. Her smooth composure shattered for a moment as she fumbled for words. Excuses, justifications, all paper-thin and crumbling. Olivia stared at the table, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles whitened. My father's eyes, usually so controlled, widened with every revelation. There was a pain there, a realization that went beyond betrayal. For so long, he'd chosen comfort over confrontation, harmony over truth. But harmony built on secrets is brittle, doomed to collapse. The board was stunned. Some members, old friends of my mother, stalwart supporters of the Carter legacy, immediately demanded a full audit. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The tension broke when my father, voice gravelly with years of holding back, asked, "Why, Lorraine?" The silence was heavy. For once, the roles in our family had shifted. The usurpers crumbled under the weight of evidence. My father finally saw the ugly truth, that those he trusted most had nearly destroyed everything. From there, procedures moved at a breakneck pace. The family lawyer called for a freeze on all assets. The board refused to transfer any shares or authority. Lorraine and Olivia were asked to leave the premises. No shouting, only the cold finality of decisions made. My father, stunned, regarded me as if unsure whether to embrace or apologize. For a brief, flickering moment, I thought he might do both. In the days after, the house felt uncannily quiet. The hum of conspiracy replaced by the slow pulse of rebuilding. I was asked to stay, not as a guest, but as the emerging steward of our fractured legacy. With the burden of deception stripped away, my sense of purpose deepened. Each day brought new tasks, unraveling the convoluted transactions, meeting with attorneys, debating with the auditors. Yet, for the first time, I didn't shrink from these responsibilities. I fought for my family, not the fractured one that put walls between us, but the idea of the Carter family I'd always dreamed could be real. The staff, who had once left rooms when I entered, now lingered. Their respect returned. Small tokens of kindness emerged. A breakfast tray left with a handwritten note. A gardener tipping his hat with a smile.
I'll contact you soon.
Even the air seemed lighter, as if the house itself had taken a long, trembling breath. My father grew quieter with each passing day. There were moments, awkward and raw, when I'd find him wandering the halls, a haunted look in his eyes. Eventually, he stopped me in the solarium one afternoon and said softly, "I failed you, Emily. I let this happen." I looked at him, and for the first time, felt the ache of forgiveness overtake anger. "You believed in family," I said. "It nearly cost us everything, but it's also what gave me the strength to fight." He smiled then, a real tired smile. "Your mother would have been proud." I thought of her often in those days, her quiet wisdom echoing with every decision I made. In her memory, I made changes. Real investments in the community, a workplace culture rooted in integrity, open meetings with the board. I didn't want victory to twist me into someone I wasn't. Justice, I'd realized, wasn't about revenge or restoring my own pride. It was about healing, and that's what I fiercely set about doing. It wasn't easy. The press caught a whiff of the scandal and circled, hungry for drama. Old family friends called, equal parts nosy and supportive. I set boundaries, politely but firmly, determined not to let public opinion shake hard-won resolve. The Carter name meant something again. but I wouldn't let it become just another empty symbol. Most nights, after the chaos had faded, I'd sit by the fire in my mother's study, reflecting on the journey. I'd learned that power could corrupt, but it could also redeem. That even in the darkest betrayal, there was still a sliver of hope, and that when the world demands you surrender, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take a single, stubborn step forward. As for Lorraine and Olivia, they faded from our world. The legal battles were exhausting, but fair. My goal wasn't to ruin them, just to ensure they could never again twist trust into poison inside these walls. In their absence, I found the family I'd longed for both within and beyond blood. People who stood for loyalty, honesty, and grace under fire. Looking back, I realized this fight wasn't about inheritance or legacy. It was about finding my own voice when everyone expected me to disappear. About proving, to myself most of all, that I was more than the caricature the world saw. That beneath the designer clothes and perfect manners, there was a heart capable of fierce love and relentless courage. The Carter estate didn't magically become a fairy tale castle overnight, but it became a home, restored, renewed, and open to whatever storms or sunshine lay ahead. And as I locked the last secret away, I knew my mother would rest easy, knowing her daughter had finally come home, not by inheritance, but by sheer will. Reflections. After the storm, when the dust finally settled, and the whirlwind of accusation, heartbreak, and confession faded into a distant hum, I found myself walking the echoing halls of the Carter estate. This time, not as a ghost, but as someone living, breathing, newly awake in her own skin. There is a kind of quiet that feels earned, not empty. A silence pregnant with understanding, not loss. That's the quiet I found after the storm. One that let me actually listen to my own heart without fear of being drowned out by all the noise that had ruled my life for so long. Every evening, as the golden hour slanted through the high windows and painted the floor with rectangles of light, I would pause, often near the grand piano in the parlor, or beneath the portrait of my mother smiling gently from her ornate gold frame. I kept thinking, how many times had I walked this house, desperate for belonging, for approval, for some scrap of warmth from a family caught up in its own careful rituals and relentless ambitions. Now the house and the landscape of my own spirit were changed, bruised, certainly, but tender in a way that promised new growth. The truth is, nothing about the battle for the Carter legacy had been simple. After the asset freeze and all the evidence came to light, my days blurred into equal parts adrenaline and exhaustion. There were lawyers to meet, statements to draft, press to avoid, and, most daunting of all, awkward conversations with my father. Gone was the intimidating patriarch. In his place stood a man unmoored by betrayal, aging faster than I remembered, searching for something solid to hold on to. We had both been changed by the upheaval, our illusions shattered, and our old patterns as useless as yesterday's news. I had always thought the prize was the Carter fortune, the keys, as it were, to the kingdom. But in the end, what I clung to most was a stubborn sense of self-respect. The knowledge that I'd been brave, not merely in defense of a legacy, but in defense of truth and my own worth. Because that's what no one ever tells you about fighting for what's right within your own family. Compromise often means betraying yourself. And courage sometimes means admitting how scared you really are. Rebuilding wasn't about revenge. It was about trust, how fragile it is, how easily it slips through your fingers, how badly we all need it. I started by reaching out to the people who had stayed neutral through the madness, the staff who had risked their livelihoods to tip me off. Old friends of my mother, who hadn't been able to act, but who now hovered with teacups and gentle words. Forgiveness, too, was a slow process, one that started with myself. Some nights, I'd find myself sitting on the balcony, legs curled under me on the old wrought iron bench, listening to a faraway train whistle or the chirr of late summer cicadas. If you've ever spent your life being misunderstood, reduced to caricature by gossip, or dismissed as just another overprivileged heiress, you'll understand how hard it can be to confront what's inside. All the stories told about me, spoiled, icy, distant, were easier to swallow than the truth that I'd spent years afraid of being unlovable in the only home I'd ever known. Yet, in exposing the deepest wounds, I found others carrying scars of their own. My father, for all his failings, was more broken than cruel. One stifling afternoon, I stumbled on him in my mother's study, his hands trembling as he fingered her old letters, tears sliding freely down cheeks I'd always pictured as stone. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The moment carried its own language, one of regret, longing, and, at long last, humility. My healing became inseparable from the work I undertook. To untangle the Carter finances, yes, but more importantly, to untangle the web of silence and pride that had held us apart for so long. I instituted weekly open board meetings, invited employees from every level to voice concerns, and renovated parts of the estate, not for show, but for gathering. Dinners with laughter, rooms for community events, afternoons spent with children from the hospital where my mother had once volunteered. There, I saw how legacy could become generosity, how old wounds could, quite literally, shelter new life. The thing about overcoming betrayal is that it doesn't erase the hurt. Lorraine and Olivia faded from our daily lives, but their shadows lingered in a piece of music that suddenly made me tear up in a quiet moment when a floorboard creaked unexpectedly, in the flash of suspicion that crossed my mind when a new stranger appeared at the door. Trust is never instant. It is a fragile, patient creature, coaxed back little by little, feral and wary. And yet, I learned to honor those scars. In the end, I think that's where true adulthood finds you. Not in some grand victory, not atop a mountain of money or applause, but sitting quietly in the ashes, cleaning your wounds, and choosing 1,000 times again to love what remains. My mother's advice came back to me often, her voice clear in my heart. Be kinder than you feel. People are carrying battles you can't see. I began mending the relationships I still valued. I invited my stepsister Lauren for dinner. Awkward, certainly, but absolutely honest. I apologized for my own coldness in the early years and heard her confessions in return. Her jealousy, her insecurity, her sense of never truly belonging. We laughed, even cried, inventing a kind of sisterhood neither of us would have thought possible a year before. For my father, healing was slower. We went from formality to hesitation to finally tentative affection. Sometimes we lost our footing. Once, in the middle of a heated discussion about charitable giving, he blurted, "You sound just like your mother." For a second, I braced for resentment, but the glint in his eye was fond, not angry. We were learning a new dance, one that required both forgiveness and boundaries. Restoring the Carter name meant inviting change, but also inviting vulnerability. I was never the same girl who tiptoed through parties, hope stretched thin as spun sugar. I had become, somewhat to my shock, unbreakable, not because pain or betrayal no longer hurt, but because I trusted myself to survive it, to turn it into something fierce and kind. Reporters came and went, their stories often missing the real core of what happened. After a while, it didn't matter. My self-worth was no longer measured in headlines, or in who showed up at our annual galas, or even by which paintings hung on the walls. I measured it nightly by a kind of inner peace, my ability to meet my own eyes in the mirror, to listen to the truth, no matter how unwelcome, without looking away. Legacy is a wide, hungry word. For a long time, it tasted bitter. But now, in the post-storm hush, I could savor the sweetness of a future built with intention instead of obligation. My hope for the Carter estate was no longer to preserve it unchanged, a marble mausoleum to old battles, but to make it breathe, full of music, laughter, and the relentless, unglamorous acts of repair. Sometimes late at night, when the house finally settled into a gentle stillness, I'd run my fingertips across my mother's piano keys and play a simple tune, one without grandeur, just honest melody. I imagined her beside me, as proud as she ever was, her legacy living on, not in the gold or the oil or the family name, but in every honest moment I chose to keep fighting for love and for truth. The storm had changed us all. What remained, finally, was a place I could truly call home.